welcome to The Artist's Craft. I am your host, Stacey Cochran, and I'm absolutely thrilled to have in studio with us today author Pat MacEnulty, who is the author of 5 books. Her latest novel, Piic, was published by Livingston Press from the University of West Alabama. Pat lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she teaches at Johnson and Wales University. Thank you very much for joining us in studio.
Thank you, Stacey.
Well, tell us a little bit about Piic. What is the story? What is the story about?
The story is about a 15-year-old girl named Eli Burns. It's a coming-of-age story. It takes place in 1970, so you've got that whole backdrop of the Vietnam War going on and all of the changes in race relations that were going on at that time period. And she lives in Augusta, Georgia with her step-grandmother, Maddie, who is an opera singer. And when Maddie dies, she has to go live with her father, who has started another family in Webster Groves, Missouri. So she goes from a rather sheltered life to something. He's an anti-war activist, and he's a minor player in the Weather Underground. So suddenly her life becomes very different.
Who do you see as the audience for this book? Is it intended as a young adult novel, or is it intended for an adult audience?
I think that's a great question. I find that especially a lot of people my age who are from that era really relate to this book, and they love it, and I'm getting a lot of great feedback. But when I was writing it, I wrote it every summer. Well, I would write a chapter a summer while I was teaching at a summer arts camp for teenagers at Winthrop University. So every year I would read a chapter to these teenagers, and they loved it. They responded so enthusiastically to it, and every year they wanted to hear another chapter. Finally, after 5 or 6 summers, I decided I had to finish the book. So I think that it really is for both. I think teenagers, my daughter, who's a college student who really hasn't read that much of my work, finally read this, and she loved it. And then, of course, I find people who are my age, I think they respond to the nostalgia.
Do you have to have an emotional connection? How important is the emotional connection to your characters as you're developing a novel? It's a long process to write a book. How important is the emotional connection that you have to your characters?
I think it's absolutely critical. If you're not really engaged, if their lives and what's going on in that world is not completely absorbing you, then I really don't even know how you write the book. And that's what happened to me. Even though I sort of wrote it in fits and starts, whenever I was writing it, I became completely involved in the story and in the characters and their lives.
It sounds like you had a very interesting writing process for Piic, where you were writing a little bit each summer. That's not your standard writing process, is it? Or is it?
No, it's not really. My first novel took a long, long time because it was my first novel. After that, the second and third really didn't take very long. This one, actually, I probably started it 10 years ago, and I just didn't know where it was going. But I couldn't let it go either. So, as I said, each summer I'd work on it a little bit, and then finally, when I really had that sense of where it was going to go, how it was going to end, then I reverted back to my normal writing process, which is work on it every day by hand in a coffee shop, and then go home and type it.
Well, the author is Pat MacEnulty, and the book that we're talking about is Piic. Would you like to read a little bit from the book?
Sure. Okay, I am going to read from the very first chapter. It's starting on page 3. At this time, she is 14 years old. She's still in Augusta, Georgia, and you'll be introduced to Maddie, who is her step-grandmother. As I stood, shrouded in the darkness backstage, watching Maddie sink to her knees in the bright spotlight and collapse in a pile of pink silk, I was not thinking of death, or even of opera. Around her, the singers mourned, and the tenor bellowed, "Mimi," in a crescendo of notes. But my mind easily transposed the scene, and instead of Mimi and her bohemian friends, I was the one sinking to the ground, gazing into the greenish-brown eyes of Wolfgang, who had finally realized how much he loved me. He was bending down ever so slowly to kiss me. At that moment, the curtain closed for the final time, and the performers came rushing off stage. And Pauline, the contralto, was saying to Maddie, "No one dies as brilliantly as you do, Matilda." Then Maddie stood in front of me, her eyes sparkling, full of spotlights, her hands clasping mine. "How did you like the performance, precious?" As if the applause wasn't enough. It never was. She always needed my approval, and I always gave it. I may have become a teenager without either of us expecting it, but still I adored her. "Brilliant," I said, stealing Pauline's word because I hadn't fully collected myself back out of Wolfgang's arms. Then, as reality came into focus, I added my favorite word of the moment, phenomenal. Maddie smiled with relief, as if she'd feared I might suddenly say that she was awful and she should never show her face on a stage again. She kissed the air beside my ear as her cheek brushed against mine. "Come help me out of this straitjacket." Just like that, I was once again Maddie's little helper. I followed her to the backstage dressing room where the other women were already stripping out of their long dresses and holding the hair off the backs of their necks, standing in front of a large revolving fan. "Jesus, it's hot out there," one of them said. We weaved through the other women to Maddie's dressing table in the back. Light bulbs shone from the sides and top of the mirror, and Maddie sat down to wipe off her pancake makeup with a tissue smeared with cold cream. I helped her take off the blonde cascading wig and then placed it on the styrofoam head with its crayoned blue eyes. When I was little, I grew quite attached to that head and named her Dilly. For one solid year when I was 6, I dragged Dilly around with me and explained to people that she was a queen and I was her butler. The women's voices in the dressing room climbed over each other in that after-show mix of hilarity, exhaustion, and yearning for it not to end quite yet. The thing they felt was almost palpable, and I knew they'd all head somewhere to unwind. Usually, the unwinding happened at our house, where Miss Johnny would have left plates full of little sandwiches, and the bar would be stocked, the Steinway freshly tuned, its ivory keys waiting for Carl to sit down and dance his fingers over them. "You know, I could never play Mimi in New York at my age," Maddie said to no one in particular, "and yet I don't think I've ever done her better." "It just goes to show you," Pauline called from her vanity nearby, "age gives us the experience to bring depth to a role." "You're right," Maddie said, wiping the tissue across her eyelids. "But I don't need to grow another second older, thank you. I've got enough bloody experience." Pauline laughed. When they were together, they obsessed about their ages. Maddie swore she'd go home and jump off the London Bridge if she had to grow old and feeble with her hips breaking and her skin sagging to the ground the way her grandmother had. Maddie had left England at the age of 19, but it was still home to her, and she made a point of keeping her fancy-sounding accent intact. "Are we going to your house, Matilda?" Louise asked. "Of course," Maddie said. "Too bad there aren't any good pubs in this town." "It depends what you mean by good," Pauline said. "A classy piano bar like we had in New York is what I mean," Maddie said. She stood up and tried to unzip herself. I took the zipper from her fingers and pulled down. "Thank you, precious," she said. She pulled the dress from her shoulders, and I started to turn away to go outside and buy a bottle of Coke from the machine in the hallway with a nickel in my pocket. Even then, a drink for a nickel was a novelty. But as I was turning, Maddie bent forward sharply. She gasped, and a wave of terror washed over me. "Maddie?" I asked, wheeling back toward her. "Are you all right?" She looked up, and our eyes met in the mirror. I noticed sweat against her hairline. Her gray eyes looked startled. "What is it?" I asked. She held onto the chair in front of her and grimaced. "I just had the worst pain." "Is it gas?" Pauline asked. Maddie straightened up slowly and let the dress fall to the floor. She was wearing a bra underneath and a half-slip. "And look how fat I am," she muttered. "I couldn't even put on a girdle earlier." Pauline stood up. We both stared at Maddie's abdomen bulging beneath her white nylon slip. "I think you should see a doctor," Pauline said.
The author is Pat MacEnulty. The book she's reading from is Piic. It's on sale as we speak at bookstores all around the country. So you should check out the reviews and check out the book. It's an outstanding book. So Eli, you know, she, as a result of her grandmother's, and it's not even by blood, is it?
No, it's a step-grandmother, but it's her guardian.
It's really her parent in the story.
Yeah.
Because of her father and mother not being there. But as a result of Maddie's failing health, she has to go live with her father.
Yes.
Where does that idea come from? How do you develop an idea like this novel? Where did it come from?
Well, my mother was a musician, and she actually was the accompanist and orchestral director for a small opera guild in Jacksonville, Florida. So that was where I got the idea of the opera, and she also was the musical director for a lot of musicals, and so I kind of grew up in the theater, and that atmosphere was so important in my childhood, and I just never wanted to that was so interesting to me, that whole world. So that sort of was where that part sprang from. And then when I was 15, I went to live with my older brother and his wife and their 2 kids in Webster Groves, Missouri. So a lot of that material is in the book, but it's not an autobiographical book because she has different kinds of adventures than I did.
What was the first image for the book? Do you start with an image, or do you start with the idea of a character when you're starting a novel?
What was the first image? Boy, because I did start that so long ago, but I think one of the things that kept coming up was someone saying, "You always die beautifully." And this opera singer who was used to dying on stage is now going to die in real life. And I think that image, that idea really resonated and sort of sent this book into the direction that it went into.
Do you outline when you're writing? What is your writing process like? You described earlier how you had written this over several summers. Take us through just a typical day of writing for you. What is the daily process like?
I don't generally outline. I do have a mystery novel called Time to Say Goodbye, and that one I didn't really outline, but I did write a synopsis first, and of course it changed a lot as I wrote. So I don't outline, but I do like to know where it's going to end, because if it doesn't end up, if I don't know where it ends, then it winds up, I have several half-finished novels on my computer because I don't know where they're going to end.
How important is the character arc, where a character is at the beginning of the novel and where you want her to be at the end of the novel? And is that something that you have in mind when you begin, or do you get a sense of where the character is going to be emotionally or what she's learned by the end of the novel as you're writing it?
I think it's really important for me to know that that character is going to change and to have an idea of how she's going to change. So that arc is definitely in my mind as I'm writing, and then it's just the series of events that get her to that point and get her through that.
What did you learn about yourself in the process of writing this book?
What did I learn about myself? I think that what's interesting is, while Eli is partially comes from my experience and certainly my consciousness, I was working with teenagers, as I mentioned, and I was influenced a lot by them, and I realized there are many ways to do adolescence. One doesn't need to do it exactly the way I did it. And some ways are healthier and better than the way I did adolescence. So I think that's what I learned. I don't know if I learned so much about myself, but I definitely learned something.
It made you sympathize and have a little bit more compassion for different kinds of adolescence, it sounds like.
Yes, it did. It absolutely did.
That's very cool. Well, again, the author is Pat MacEnulty. The book we're talking about is Piic, which is on sale everywhere. You should check out a copy today as you're watching the interview. Go over to the internet, check it out. You can find it online. So I think I know the answer to this, but which is more important to you when you're writing a character or plot? How important is plot, if at all, as you're writing a book?
I think it depends on the book. Some books, like my first novel, was very voice-driven, and plot wasn't that important. However, conflict and tension are important. Even if you don't have this meticulously figured out plot, you better have conflict and you better have tension, or your reader is just not going to stay interested. So for my mystery novel, plot was very important. You know, I had to think about how things could happen, and you still want to make sure that you are not predictable. I didn't really want to follow a formula. So, but it must be said that plot comes from character. Plot comes from who your character is, what their motivation is, what their goals are.
Very well said. So I'm always interested when I'm talking with a writer about why you became a writer. Was there something in your childhood that sent you on the path to become a writer? I think a lot of it is I just want to find out why I've chosen to try and do this as a career. But when did you first know you wanted to be a writer? And what do you think, Pat, what was it that said, okay, I want to try a career out in the arts?
Oh, well, my family are all in the arts. My mother's a musician. Both of my brothers were musicians, and my father was a musician. My grandmother was an artist. So, and I grew up around books. I couldn't play, I was not interested in music. So, but there were all of these books around me, and the stories, I loved the stories, and when I was little, while my mother was in rehearsals, I would sit around playing with my marbles or my plastic horses, and I'd be making up stories. And I think the music almost helped transport me to some other world. And I think sometimes some writers, I know this isn't everyone, but some writers have some sort of traumatic events in their childhood, and they learn how to sort of separate themselves from the event, and a narrator almost comes up in their head to explain what's going on. It's sort of a protective process.
Sure.
And I was about 12 when I decided that this is what I wanted to do.
Wow, so very young.
Yeah. I mean, I did a lot of other things in the meantime, but I knew that this was always where I was going.
And then your parents were pretty encouraging, I would imagine, it sounds like.
My mother was definitely encouraging, yes. Yeah.
Now you chose a career in academia as well. You have a PhD from Florida State University in English. Can you talk about, you know, our audience for a lot of these interviews is composed of aspiring writers and some writers who are published and are on their path to, you know, their career. Can you talk about the decision to balance the life of being a writer with a life in academia in contrast to, say, in publishing, like becoming an editor or something like that? How did you decide I want to go into academia, get a PhD, and teach?
I think that sort of happened by default, because I actually do editing too. I do freelance editing, and I've done journalism. I love journalism. I think there are several paths that you can take to be a writer. One of them is journalism, and another one is academia, and then the third is to write bestsellers and just be a writer. The reason I think I chose academia is because I knew I had to write what I wanted to write. And maybe it would be a bestseller, or maybe it wouldn't. But I couldn't rely on that. I needed to be able to write what I wanted to write and not have the market dictate what I was going to write. So I had to have a way to support myself. For several years, I didn't teach, or I just taught part-time. And I wrote as a freelance writer. But you know, at some point you have to have insurance, and also I do enjoy I enjoy the interaction with young people. That just adds to the quality of my life.
Sure. What are some of the common mistakes that you see in aspiring writers' works? Is there something that you see consistently as a teacher of creative writing that if you could just go in and say, don't make this mistake, I've seen it, 100 times, 1,000 times. Is there something that you see that somebody watching could learn from?
Wow, I hate to bring up that old cliche, but it's so true. I do keep seeing this over and over again, and that is writers who want to tell rather than show, who don't want to spend the time creating the scenes that allow us to get to know the character. So that's a huge thing, and I think too, sometimes writers there's just not enough tension, and sometimes I'll send one of my books to or something I'm working on to my friend who's a writer, and she'll say the same thing to me. Torque up the tension, turn it up. So that's really important.
What are some of the ways that an aspiring writer, or any writer, can really get into showing a scene rather than telling a scene? What are some of the things that writers can do to show a scene?
I think you need to slow down. We write at this sort of breakneck speed because these ideas are flying through our heads, and that's fine for your first draft, but then you need to go back and imagine that you're a camera. Imagine that you're seeing everything. And it also, I think, is very useful to be inside that character's body, be inside that character's head. What are they thinking? What is that character feeling at that particular moment?
We've got a couple of interesting questions here, but I'm sure we're coming down to our last few minutes, so I want to pick the one that perhaps is best. Where did you grow up, if you don't mind my asking? Where'd you grow up, and how does that affect the kinds of stories you tell, do you think?
Well, I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. And we were talking about this the other day, is Florida really the South? Well, Jacksonville, Florida is the South, but my parents were from New England, so I had a different perspective. I didn't have a completely Southern perspective, but I think that being in the South definitely influenced the way that I write and the way I look at story. And then I lived in Florida all the way up until about 10 years ago when we moved to Charlotte. And someday I'll probably move back.
It sounds like most of your family came from New England, but you grew up in Florida. So did you feel conflicted about your place? Because I notice place is very central to Piic, and having a place really is kind of central to that.
I think so. I mean, I didn't have some of the same attitudes that my peers had when I was growing up. And I infinitely preferred the attitudes that I had, and I'm glad that I did. But it made me, I think, hyper aware of things going on in society that maybe my peers weren't quite as aware of.
Very interesting. So what kind of advice would you give to a writer who has just embarked on a career that has hit whatever point it is that writers hit, where they say, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and they're hell-bent on doing it? What kind of advice would you give to somebody who has made that decision?
connect with other writers, be in workshops, have your small group, have your support system. I think that is vital. And keep at it, because you could be lucky and the first thing you write makes it to the bestseller list, or you may need to do it for years and years and years. I would say don't do it unless you're committed to doing it, whether you're successful or not.
Well, the author is Pat MacEnulty. We're talking a little bit about her writing process, how she has grown as a writer over the course of writing 5 works of fiction. You're working on a memoir as we speak.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit in the last minute and a half that we have here on some of the challenges of writing a memoir in contrast to a novel?
I think the biggest challenge I'm having is figuring out what tense to write it in. I keep wanting to write it in the in the present tense, and then some parts will slip into the past tense. So I'm playing around with that, and of course there are certain family members that I'm going to have to let read and say, if you're going to censor now or forever hold your peace. So there are challenges. Yeah, with a novel you don't have to do that, but with a memoir you have to say, look, I'm putting this out there in the world and I need to let you know that's what I'm doing.
So how do you make that decision? How do you make the ethical decision when somebody else's life is coming into play with your writing?
It's tricky. I changed names of certain people that I know would prefer to keep their privacy intact. And like I said, I get permission from other people.
Very cool. Well, we're just about out of time here on this week's episode of The Artist's Craft. I am your host, Stacey Cochran. We've been talking with Pat MacEnulty. Her book is Piic. Go check it out at online retailers and bookstores in your area. Thank you, Pat, very much for joining us in studio today.
Thank you.
And for all of us here at The Artist's Craft, I want to thank you for watching this week's episode. Thank you.